Well, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're listening from, and welcome to yet another Ball Publishing webinar. I'm Chris Beatties, editor of GrowerTalks and Green Profit magazines and the newsletter Acres Online, and I'm going to be your host for the next hour or so as we learn more about, well, you see it right there on your screen, Ellepots plus HydraFiber equals young plant success. Now, I've hosted quite a few webinars on the topic of wood fiber substrates in general and about HydraFiber in particular, but never one that's focused exclusively on propagation. So this one should be interesting. And a lot of the questions that you guys tend to ask on wood fiber is about propagation. And so this should help answer some of those questions. Now, to do that, as always, I need experts. And thankfully fortunately, I should say, for you and me both, I've got two of them for you. And the first is Dr. Bill Argo from Blackmore Company and Ellepot, USA. Welcome, Bill.
Hello.
Bill, so where are you broadcasting from today, my friend?
I'm broadcasting from my house. Nice, bright, sunny Michigan.
I was going to say, you don't want to be more specific. a house somewhere. So you're in Michigan, where it's nice and sunny now. And you told me you've been with, you are a PhD, but you've never been a professor. You started with Blackmore straight out of school.
I've been with Blackmore since 1996.
Nice. So you've done a lot of research on starting young plants. Because that's one of the big things that Blackmore is all about, seeding, and now they do the Ellepots, and so it's great to have you on board as our expert for the day. Now, representing our sponsor, Profile Products, and an expert on wood fiber in his own right, he is a veteran of these GrowerTalks webinars, Mr. Daniel Norden, Senior Technical and R&D Manager for Horticulture. Welcome, Daniel.
Hey, Chris. How's it going?
Very well, thank you. And Daniel, you're always broadcasting from some unique, undisclosed location. Can you tell us where you are today? At least a hint, like your house or something?
Today it's less exciting. I'm in sunny South Carolina at my home, so it's a new experience for me because normally I'm in a car when I'm doing these.
That's something I forget if we told people that before or not. I truly say you can do a webinar from anywhere if you have an internet connection, and you have done them from like interstate exits and things like that, rest stops. Fascinating. All right, and
Exactly.
me, I'm nowhere exciting. I am, of course, broadcasting live from the palatial GrowerTalks studios in West Chicago, Illinois. So we've got South Carolina, Michigan, and Illinois all represented, and no telling where our audience is today, all over the world, no doubt. So before I turn it over to Bill and Daniel for the topic at hand, a little bit of housekeeping. First off, as always, if you've got questions, there's a little question section somewhere there on your desktop, easy to find. Type it in. I will either pose it to our experts as we go along if it's kind of pertaining to the topic they happen to be speaking about. If it's not, we'll save it either for in between the two speakers or for the very end. We'll be sure to leave some Q&A time in there. If for some reason you have to leave the webinar, heaven forbid, or you want to watch it again or share it with a colleague, you'll be able to do that at the archive, growertalks.com/webinars, conveniently the same place you signed up for the webinar, and I'll try to get it up within a half hour or an hour of us completing the webinar, which should be right at the top of the hour. So I think that is everything. And Bill, you're going to go first. I'm going to give you control of the ship. You ready? Take it away.
I am. Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. Today I'm going to talk about Ellepots and HydraFiber. Like most people who work in the industry, Ellepots or HydraFiber has shown up the last couple of years as a new technology. Large growers have gotten into it and are using it primarily as a perlite replacement, but they're using it for other things, other replacements too. More or less, they've had a lot of success with it. And they're growing pretty much every finished crop you can imagine in HydraFiber or peat HydraFiber mixes. the reason they switched to HydraFiber is cost. Is probably the primary thing. They're also using it as a perlite substitute or a bark substitute or a peat substitute. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about using HydraFiber as a peat substitute. So in something near and dear to my heart, talking about pH management and HydraFiber. Now, we add limestone to peat to neutralize the acidity from the peat itself and to raise the initial pH to an acceptable level, around pH of 6. So when you add limestone to a mix, there's two fractions to it. One is a reactive fraction, and that's the limestone that reacts initially to get the pH up. The second fraction is the residual fraction. That's the unreacted limestone that remains in the substrate after the initial pH is reached. This graph shows the effect of reactive lime. So you're basically adding lime at mixing, and you add water and pH comes up to around 6. And that usually happens, the pH should stabilize after around 7 to 14 days. Once that happens, all the reactive lime is gone. Now, residual lime gives you the long-term buffering. When we talk about buffering in peat-based or bark-based mixes, a lot of times it's not the cation exchange capacity, but it's residual lime that's giving us our buffering. Now, to illustrate this was from an experiment in the late 90s that John Birnbaum and I did. We took a coarse sphagnum peat perlite mix and either added 2.5 pounds of a hydrated lime, so a very reactive lime that leaves no residual, or 12 pounds of a dolomitic lime, less reactive, a lot more residual. And we fed these with different fertilizer and water solutions. The graph shows the hydrated lime, which is the solid squares, or the hollow squares, which is the dolomitic lime treatment. Now, these were in patients grown in 4-inch pots using, in this case, an acidic fertilizer solution. Over time, you can see the difference in the pH between the hydrated, low residual lime treatment and the dolomitic, the high residual lime treatment. In general, all the buffering came from the dolomitic lime. That's what gives buffering in peat-based mixes. Now, we also did this with a fine sphagnum peat. Now, the fine sphagnum peat should, in theory, have more buffering capacity. It also has a higher lime requirement. In this case, it had a lime requirement of 4.5 pounds of hydrated lime to get the pH up to around 6. But we could use the same 12 pounds per yard of dolomitic lime to get the pH up. Doing the same treatments, you can see with the hydrated lime, the low residual lime, the pH went down very, very quickly. But with the dolomitic lime, the pH held very stable until about week 12. With the fine sphagnum peat, the dolomitic lime, the dolomitic residual lime ran out, and the pH came crashing down. So the important things to remember is that the residual lime gives you your buffering, and anything that influences that residual lime will reduce or increase buffering capacity. So if we look at HydraFiber, if you're using it as a peat replacement, you're reducing the peat fraction you're using. So reducing the peat fraction will reduce the lime incorporation rate, which will reduce the residual lime, which will reduce buffering. So in other words, if you're at 30% HydraFiber in your mix, you're probably fine. You won't have to change anything because everybody's grown in a 70-30 peat perlite mix with very good success. So same thing with HydraFiber. It shouldn't influence your pH management at all if you're at 70-30, 70 peat, 30 HydraFiber. As you go to higher and higher levels of HydraFiber, you're reducing lime and you're reducing residual lime. So your buffering will be less. If you do go to higher rates, higher levels of HydraFiber, make sure you protect your iron efficient crops. Those are the geraniums, marigolds, New Guinea impatiens, Lisianthus pentas. You can include verbenas and probably sun patience in that too. Now, if you ever have iron deficiency, you can fix an iron deficiency with a couple drenches of the appropriate iron. Make those plants green and make them sellable. The problem with iron toxicity, iron manganese toxicity, is that you damage the plant. And so the only things you can do is grow that plant, grow new growth over the top of the damage, remove the damage. All that takes time. So it's important to remember that with iron manganese toxicity, if I have that problem, I've damaged the crop. So when you're growing those types of crops and you want to use hydrofiber at higher rates, make sure you protect the iron efficient crop. So how do you do that? One is to consider a high pH mix or a high lime mix. That will add more lime, more residual lime, and give you more buffering. Make sure you don't go wild with the lime rate, because you can start out much, much too high and cause problems because of high pH, even with iron efficient crops. So having a high lime rate is a good thing, but you can go too far. Another is, just with your iron efficient crops, use a 70-30 blend. You can use the 50-50 blend or the 60-40 blend for crops like petunias, pansies, ones where the iron efficiency isn't a problem. Finally, track the pH of the iron efficient crops on a regular basis and make sure you take appropriate actions when necessary. My experience with hydrofiber and propagation has a lot more to do with direct stick type propagation. So mums, poinsettias, even some pot crops, big pot crops for big growers, they'll direct stick those cuttings instead of going through a plug or propagation type scenario. It's just like it works well with finished crops, it works fine with propagation. You're adding a material that gives aeration structure to the mix, so there's really no problems. But if we talk about Ellepots and HydraFiber, you got to remember, most growers are purchasing a plug or propagation mix, even large growers that make HydraFiber mixes for their finished crops. So the availability of substrates containing HydraFiber is limited because it's a new technology and the number of companies offering HydraFiber substrates is still limited. So in general, you don't run into Ellepot substrates that are made with HydraFiber at this time. Now going forward, I'm going to talk about my ideal substrate and how you should formulate Ellepot substrate with HydraFiber in it. First thing I want to do is talk about the machine. Okay, this is an example of a H101 Ellepot machine. Now, first we have the soil hopper. As the soil goes from the soil hopper, it's pulled into the machine with a vacuum. Now, the vacuum setting is important. You want the vacuum setting to be around 0.15 to 0.2. That will make an Ellepot that's fairly loose, but can still be handled, and has a compression roughly the same as what a properly filled plug tray will have. Finally, it's pulled into the machine, the paper is sealed, and then it's cut with the cutting knife. Once it's cut into segments, then the Ellepot can be placed in trays. Now, with substrates, the problem I'm going to have, if the substrate's causing me problems, it's going to happen at one of these three locations. So, choosing an Ellepot mix. First thing I'm going to do is talk about what not to do. So, do not use a plug mix. Plug mix are very fine. They don't bridge well. And so when they're pulled into an Ellepot mix, it won't hold together well. So what you have to do is turn up the vacuum so it becomes overcompressed, too much compaction. So you want to stay away from very, very fine mixes with very, very fine components. Next thing you don't want to do is use a mix that has a lot of sticks in it. So the problem with sticks are they can cause the intake tube, and they can also cause problems with cutting, which causes the paper to tear rather than be cut. So if you think about it, you don't want to necessarily use a finish mix or you don't want to use a plug mix, but you don't want to use a finish mix either. The finish mixes often have a lot of sticks in them. Finally, you don't want to use materials that are extremely coarse. In this case, this is a large, very, very coarse core material that had very, very long fibers, 2-3 inches long. Plus the individual chunks of core were probably the size of a penny. There was considerable problems going through the machine itself, being able to pull it in with a vacuum, and because of the long fibers and large particles that acted like sticks, it couldn't be cut well. Finally, the moisture that you use to fill, the moisture of the substrate you use to make the Ellepots is important. If it's too dry, it won't hold together well. And so you have to turn the compaction up to make it hold together, which makes compacted Ellepots. And that's something you don't want to do. If it's too wet, wet mix is heavy. And so you have to turn the vacuum up and you end up with a high compaction mix again, if you can move it through the machine at all. Anybody who's ever tried to fill flats has gone through the same issues. Too dry, if you try to fill a plug tray with too dry a mix, it bridges and it collapses on the first irrigation. If it's too wet, you usually can't even make the material work because you're just making mud. So the old standby method of measuring moisture levels in a mix holds true. What you want to do is you want to take the mix and squeeze it into a ball with your hand. And that's what the picture is on the right. If the mix falls apart, so I squeeze the mix and it falls right apart, I know the mix is too dry. If I can squeeze water out of the mix when I squeeze it, it's too wet. If it squeezes together and holds together in my hand after I let go, the moisture level should be about right. It's a good way of measuring moisture level to see that it's proper for filling Ellepots, or for that matter, anything else. Okay, we've gone through what shouldn't be in an Ellepot mix. Let's talk now about what should be in an Ellepot mix. Starting with peat. The peat you want to use to make an Ellepot mix is a screened long fiber peat. So you've gotten rid of the sticks, but you also want to get rid of the dust if possible. Okay, with the European system, something along the lines of a 1 to 10 millimeter screen works well. So you've screened out the long fibers, you've screened out the sticks, but you've also screened out the dust. The Canadian system isn't quite as identifiable as the European system. But in general, what you want to ask your Canadian suppliers, you want the longest fibered screen peat available. Now, you can use a plug mix peat, a fine peat, if you have to. But make sure you don't use it at more than 50% by volume of the substrate. Because if you have it at a higher percentage, you're basically making a plug mix, and you don't want to use a plug mix. Core is another material that is often used in Ellepot substrate because it's essentially a long fiber peat. So there's two kinds of core you can buy. You can buy the unwashed core, and you really don't want to use that at more than 30% because of the high salt levels. Recently, a lot of core companies are offering washed core. With washed core, you can use that at up to 100% if you want to. Now, if you're choosing a core, you don't want it to contain long fiber, longer than 10 to 15 millimeters, because that can start binding up on the cutting blade. The third component that is often used is perlite. Now, you don't want to use a fine grade plug mix perlite for the same reasons we've been talking about before. What you want to use is a medium to coarse grade material. And ideally, you don't want a lot of dust or fine particles in it. Finally, you want a wetting agent, something that will aid in rewetting for a long period of time. So what about HydraFiber? Well, HydraFiber is a long fibered material, kind of like core is. And so you want to use it essentially similar to core. So at this point, our recommendation would be to start at 30%, just like the recommendation is for finished mixes. You want to use the smallest fiber size available. So the 0.65 material is what you're looking for, because that's probably going to be the easiest to cut. as we get into more and more mixes with hydrofiber, we're going to be doing more and more experiments. But as a starting point, that's the hydrofiber material I'd be using. Now, along with hydrofiber, because you can't use it by itself, you want to use other long fibered components. Because when you're making a mix, you want the particle sizes to be roughly the same. That will give you the best structure once you finish blending everything together. So in addition to the hydrofiber, you want to use a long fibered component like peat or coir. And again, if you're using a plug mix peat, you only use it at 50%. That means the additional 20% either has to come from something like a long fiber peat or a coir before you start adding the hydrofiber. Okay. The other thing is, this is just something I've seen over time. It seems to me the best hydrofiber mixes are the ones that actually are blended with coarse materials because it disperses the hydrofiber into the mix much better. I think when you're using fine materials along with a coarse material like hydrofiber, you tend to see a lot more of the hydrofiber and it becomes more of a problem, especially running through an Ellepot machine. So I think if you choose to use hydrofiber and long fiber components, it should be able to flow better through the machine itself. With the Ellepot system, you can choose your substrates. That's one of the big benefits. However, the components used to make the substrates need to be within certain parameters for the Ellepots to be produced correctly. That's something that's very important to know. Finally, if you have any questions about substrates used in Ellepot production, please contact your salesman at Blackmore Company or Ellepot USA, and they can help you choose the correct substrate to go along with your Ellepots.
Questions? And so far, not a single question. I'm a little bit surprised. You've either baffled them, Bill, or answered every single one. I do have one clarification that I'd like to ask you. It goes all the way back to your earliest lime slides. When you say that you're going to use, say, less peat and replace it with hydrofiber, do you need to use less lime because of that, or do you need to be sure to add lime still?
You have to add some lime, but let's take the simplest example. Let's say I'm making a 70-30 peat perlite and I switch to hydrofiber, 70-30 peat hydrofiber. That probably wouldn't change my lime rates at all. Okay. It's where I start decreasing the peat below that threshold. When I start changing the percentage of peat I'm using and I go to less peat, that's where I have to start looking at changing my lime rate. So let's say I'm using a 90-10 peat perlite and I go to 70-30 hydrofiber peat. I will change my lime rates because I've reduced my peat from 90% to 70%. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah. I've got it.
Okay.
All right. And a question has come in. I knew I'd spur thumbs on. Why not, when you're talking about what kind of mix to use, talk to your peat or wood fiber supplier or hydrofiber about what mix to use? That seems to make sense to me. Do they know enough about, if you're going to say propagate poinsettias in Ellepots, will they know what kind of mix to recommend?
I think the Blackmore Company knows more about what mixes work better with Ellepots than the mix companies do. So yes, talk to your mix companies, see what's available to them. But I think it's also worth talking to your Ellepot salesman because they can direct you to what mixes will or won't work. Whenever we set up Ellepot machines, the technicians go out and they've seen it time and time again. They've gotten a mix in to run through the Ellepot machine, and it really doesn't run well because the choice that they were given isn't something that works best with the Ellepot machine. So I think it's worth bringing in not only your mix company, but I think it's worth bringing in the Ellepot salesman to help you with that choice.
Sure. The more heads, the better, I think, to make sure you get the best option for your business. We've got another question from Peter, and I think this one would make a great segue over to Daniel's section. I'm going to click the slide right now. So Daniel, I'm going to let you handle this and use it as sort of a jumping off point. Peter wants to know, how is HydraFiber different from regular wood fiber? So go ahead and give folks who haven't been in on one of our other HydraFiber webinars a little HydraFiber 101.
Yeah,
great 101, if you would.
Yeah, great question. So, first and foremost, very excited to be here today to be talking about HydraFiber with Dr. Bill and you, Chris, and sharing our experiences with young plant propagation. Great question on how is HydraFiber different from other wood fiber technologies. There's a lot of different products in the market. One of the things I highly encourage, you guys to go back and listen to our previous webinar that we did with Dr. Glenn Fain. We kind of touch on that a little bit. We also have done some other webinars as well that gives a really good overview on that. But basically, one of the unique things about HydraFiber is we're thermally refining it, and that's what we call it. We're basically taking wood as well as bark, chips, and we are running it through a giant pressure cooker or a pressurized vessel on a more technical sense. We're injecting steam at very high temperature and under pressure, and we're fast cooking those wood chips. From there, it basically goes through a double disc refining system where it highly singulates those fibers. And then after there, we're taking it through a secondary heating process at several hundred degrees to where we are then drying it from a high moisture content down to a low moisture content. So in effect, we're actually heating it twice. And through that double heating process, we are actually helping to stabilize that product better. And that's some of the key things that we do differently than other wood technologies that are out there. So great question. I just want to, basically talk about, how growers across the country have been embracing change. I've been with the team now for almost 4 years. We brought HydraFiber to the North American market about 4 years ago, and we've seen a tremendous amount of success stories coming out of the marketplace. And, most of these success stories have really been with finished plant production, which is really what how many of the growers have chosen to work with HydraFiber from the get-go. However, very early on, we started getting questions, well, have you guys done this in young plant production? With either seeds or vegetative liners. And so we started asking ourselves, well, is it possible that HydraFiber also has a place in young plant production? And, Dr. Bill kind of answered that in his, in his slides that he had earlier. But we asked the question, especially early on, why not HydraFiber? I'll be highlighting some of the work that we've done with Dr. Glenn Fain here later in the presentation, but he came to us when we started working with him very early on that I'd love to trial this in cutting propagation. Is that something we can do? So we thought, well, that's a great idea. We started asking ourselves, there's some risks inherent to different wood technologies. There's been a lot of academic research that's been done with taking wood chips and grinding them up with either whole tree substrate or pine tree substrate. But we know that from some of that there's some handling issues, some things that growers should be doing as best management practices. But we know that from the last webinar, for those of you that were able to attend it, that HydraFiber solves some of those issues with handling for growers. And so can we mitigate those risks that are involved with using regular wood products by using HydraFiber instead? Are there some benefits of HydraFiber in propagation? So many of our finished growers are saying that they're seeing enhanced root development. So are we seeing some of those things in propagation as well? But first, let's take a moment and see how are growers across the country kind of embracing the change in young plant propagation. So this first slide that we have here, these are just, again, some examples from the field. This talk is focusing on Ellepots. And, this was a grower that wanted to trial, they have an Ellepot machine, they wanted to trial HydraFiber mixes. We made several different samples ranging from 30 to 50% HydraFiber. They used Calibrachoa. For this particular grower, Calibrachoa is a very important crop. These photos were taken about 10 to 14 days after sticking. The way they finished very, very well. But to what Dr. Bill had talked about in his presentation, we definitely agree that 30% hydrofiber is really a good place to start, because even though it worked very well in rooting at 40 and 50%, to what Dr. Bill had said is that cutting with the longer fibers at higher percentages does start to be a problem. The other thing that we definitely recommend for anyone who is working with hydrofiber and young plant propagation is, dibbling. How you dibble is very important. At 30%, we've seen no issues with dibbling, or at least from the feedback that we've gotten from growers. But regardless, we definitely recommend dibbling and making sure that you have the right size dibble so that you match it up very closely with the thickness of the cutting that you're sticking, so you have good media to cutting contact. We also have had several growers that have trialed hydrofiber very successfully in loose-fill trays. So here's a trial at a grower. We have our standard 60-40 peat perlite mix on the far left, and then they wanted to trial 30 to 50% hydrofiber. All very good results with petunias. Also, you may be asking, well, what about perennials? Well, here's a grower who took 30% hydrofiber. Now this is 065 on the far right, and in the middle we have 365, one of our coarser fibers, at 30%, and things went very well for phlox. And then also we have growers that have done woody ornamental propagation in hydrofiber mixes. So it is possible to successfully root woody ornamentals, but also, as you notice in the slide on the right, the tag says it's a core hydrofiber blend. So not only are growers using peat and hydrofiber successfully in young plant propagation, but they're also using core and hydrofiber successfully in young plant propagation. So you may be asking yourself now, well, what about seed propagation? All the examples that you've shown us from the field are all, addressing vegetative liner propagation. And so, that's one of the first areas that we started with in our R&D greenhouses. We started with some trials in 2016, evaluating this. We wanted to be very cautious when we got started with seed propagation, mainly because we know that wood in general, it has a reputation for having naturally occurring plant inhibitors. And these inhibitors are typically naturally occurring chemicals that the tree produces as its natural defense mechanism. And so these inhibitors are chemicals that are either phenolics. There's other classes of chemicals as well. And some tree species produce more or less of these chemicals, and they help ward off fungi, insects, things like that. So naturally, because these plants are used as its immune system, or the plants use these chemicals as part of its immune system, it would be logical that these could cause some issues with growing plants in them when you put them into the substrate. So we wanted to be very careful, because when taking seedlings, we can see that they potentially may be more sensitive to it. And so we wanted to look into the literature and what does the literature tell us. And so we found a paper from 2011 looking at whole tree substrate, and basically one of the conclusions that they came to is anytime you work with fresh wood, that it should be aged. And so wood should receive some sort of conditioning to help eliminate some of these compounds. In the case of composting, there's a natural heating process that's occurring from biological activity that's occurring that is then helping to break down some of these compounds. Well, the good thing, as I touched on earlier from our first question, is that hydrofiber is heated 2 times. And we know through our testing and through working with our university partners that this double heating process is what helps stabilize and remove some of these compounds from hydrofiber and helps make it safe to use. So regardless, improper handling of wood can cause growth issues. And so that's a particular concern, especially when you're dealing with seedlings, but all types of plant production. On the right-hand side of this slide, we have a grower who's doing microgreens. This is 100% wood fiber that is in this particular mat here that they're using. And as you can tell, they're having a lot of success with germinating the microgreens in it. But at Profile, we rely very heavily on many of our university partners. And in 2017, We did a study with Wageningen University, or WER, where we did a variety of testing of HydraFiber, and one of the tests that they did was a bioassay, where they looked to see if HydraFiber was essentially safe to germinate seedlings. And so through this standardized test, they germinate 3 different species, which are sensitive to some of these phytotoxic compounds. And basically the conclusion that they came to is that HydraFiber at high percentages was not toxic compared to the peat-based control that they were using. So HydraFiber, in short, is safe to use for seed germination. However, the one thing that, if you've been on some of our past webinars, one of the topics that we educate our customers on comes to fill and container fill. So one of the great things about HydraFiber is that it is fluffy in nature and it forms a matrix-like substrate. And this matrix creates unique characteristics that provide desirable physical properties for the plants to grow in. You know, this is one of the reasons why many growers will say to us, hey, look, I love the root development in the mix containing HydraFiber. However, one of the drawbacks to this is that it can create voids, or essentially bridge, in small containers. So we've done a lot of work, particularly with our partner agronomics on the equipment side. We've done a lot of testing through various machines, and we've come up with some recommendations. In general, 4-inch pots and larger are very easy to fill. But because the topic of this talk is young plant propagation, we're dealing with very small cells. And so in general, anything smaller than a 1006 pack is going to require some machine adjustments. In general, for loose fill propagation trays, we recommend sticking to anything that's larger than 100 cell count and larger. So 105s, 72s, a lot of growers are using with a lot of success. We can certainly come in and help. One of our product reps can come in and help with your pot filling equipment and help make the necessary adjustments. But essentially, the 2 things that we focus on when we come in are flow and compaction out of your pot filling equipment into your trays. So what that means is, typically, since a lot of seed propagation is done in 288s or 512s, very small tray sizes, you have to do 1 or 2 things. One, you have to be very careful with how you're filling your trays. Or 2, you just have to greatly reduce the amount of HydraFiber. So you might be able to use maybe 10% HydraFiber when doing a 288, but the reality is that, you know, we highly recommend that you stick with a larger cell tray if you want to use HydraFiber in seed propagation. So now I'd like to transition and talk about vegetative liner propagation trials that we've done with Dr. Glenn Fain of Auburn University. I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, you know, he came to us when we started working with him in 2016, and he said, you know, have you guys considered this? And so we put together a couple studies with 2 different genera. The first trial was with zonal geraniums, and 20 days after sticking, we harvested some of the plants. We had 3 different mixes that we trialed in this first round of trials. We did an 80 peat, 20 perlite control versus a 50-50 blend with 065. And then we did a 40 peat, 50 HydraFiber, 10% profile porous ceramic. Our profile porous ceramic is essentially a calcined clay that's been heated to high temperatures and has changed the physical structure. Some of these clays have been used as kind of a natural binding agent in the past for propagation, so we thought maybe it might provide some benefits, which is why we included it in this particular trial. When we look at the root dry weights 20 days after sticking, on the x-axis you can see the 3 different mixes that we tested, and then on the y-axis you can see the root dry weight in grams. The means, or the average values for each treatment are, the numbers are at the top of each bar. As you can see from the NS designation in the lower left-hand corner of the chart, we found that there were no statistical differences between the 3 different treatments with regards to root dry weight. So again, all the treatments that we tested in this particular study all tested the same with regards to rooting. Next, in the same study, we also tested scaevola, and these plants were harvested 21 days after sticking. We did the three same mixes that I just outlined with the zonal geraniums. And just like the other study with the zonal geraniums, we saw no statistical differences between the three different mixes. So the conclusion that we came to with regards to root dry weight is that we saw no differences. Now, one of the things that I'm glad Dr. Bill touched on at the beginning was with pH management. That's one of the other topics that, if you've listened to any of our other webinars, we discuss at length about. We've done quite a bit of research on pH management with substrates containing hydrofiber. But this was a trial that we did very early on, right when we brought hydrofiber to market. We didn't have a lot of this data available. And so all these mixes received the same amount of lime. And so we knew very early on, and this is just one example of some of the data 21 days after sticking when we looked at the pHs, is that even though there were no significant differences, that says that we had a lot of variability in the measurements that we took, we still saw a difference in the average pH that we got from these different treatments. As you can see, the hydrofiber treatments were well over 7, whereas the peat light mix was about 5.35. So we saw very early on that we need to reduce our lime in these mixes. So from there, in 2017, we decided to commission a series of lime-related trials in propagation. And we've done actually 2 rounds of trials with this. We tested Calibracoa in both trials, mainly because it tends to be sensitive to higher pHs. And in this particular study, you can see a shot of the plants 28 days after sticking. But this trial was a 4x3 factorial. So we have 4 different substrates that we tested, 2 peat light controls. So we did an 80-20 peat perlite, a 65-35 peat perlite, and then we did a 70-30 and 50-50 peat hydrofiber mixes. The 3 lime treatments that we did was 1 pound per yard, 3 pounds per yard, and 5 pounds per yard lime. Now, in this particular study, we didn't see actually any growth differences with regards to shoot or root dry weight. So even though we had the different lime rates, we didn't see any differences there. However, now this slide is looking at substrate pH 14 days after sticking, and you can see that we clearly have some differences in the study. And the one thing that I'd like to highlight in this chart is kind of where we optimize pH. It makes sense, especially in light of what Dr. Bill said earlier, that the 50-50 mix required the least amount of lime to hit a pH of 6. So at the 70-30 mix, we optimized pH at 3 pounds per yard. Similarly, the 65-35 mix is fairly similar to the 70-30. We also had a similar result. And then the 80-20 mix was optimized at about 5 pounds per yard of lime. So, I mean, slightly a little bit on the high side at 6.2, but still you get the point that this very closely lines up with everything that Dr. Bill said earlier. So, again, just to reiterate that the more peat that you remove from the mix, you replace with hydrofiber, you need to be careful with your lime rates. The general rule of thumb that we've mentioned in previous webinars is that for every 10% of peat that you remove and replace with hydrofiber, that you should look to reduce your lime rate by 10%. But you do have to be careful that when you start working with very low lime rates, like we have here in the example of the 50-50 mix, that could prove to have some challenges. So you have to have sufficient lime in the mix. So now everyone's gearing up, or I think most everyone is gearing up for poinsettia propagation. So, the next several trials that I'm going to be highlighting here are focused specifically on poinsettias. This is actually an example shot from one of our grower customers that sent to me last summer that does a lot of direct stick propagation. And this particular mix that they're using is a 55% peat, 45% hydrofiber. And one of the trials that we did in 2016, if I can get the slide to go, with Dr. Glenn Fain was a direct stick trial. We got a lot of questions from growers say, hey, does hydrofiber work in direct stick programs? So we tested these 3 different mixes, an 80-20, that's our typical control, and then a 70-30 hydrofiber and a 60-40 peat hydrofiber mix. With the poinsettias, we harvested the cuttings 14 days after sticking, and we found, like many of the other studies before, that we had no significant differences. Although you'll notice for both the 70-30 and 60-40 mixes that we actually maximized root dry weight, even though there were no statistical differences between these 2 mixes and the control. And on this particular slide, now you can see just an image example of roots that were washed from this particular study 14 days after sticking. Okay, and now this particular chart is looking at shoot dry weight 14 days after sticking. And now we actually have some statistical differences here. So just to highlight this, again, on the x-axis, we have the 3 different substrates that we trialed. On the y-axis, we have shoot dry weight in grams. We still have the means labeled at the top of each bars. But now instead of having an NS in capital letters in the lower left-hand corner, which on the previous slides had indicated not significant, we now have lowercase letters. And so the way to interpret that, for those of you that are not familiar, anything with a similar letter would share the same statistical significance. So in this particular example, both hydrofiber mixes, because they share the lowercase letter A, are both statistically the same. The control is a lowercase b, which means it's statistically different than the other 2 mixes. So we had statistically greater shoot dry weight in both mixes containing hydrofiber than we did with the control. So then in 2017, we did a trial with taking unrooted cuttings of Poinsettia Freedom Red. The mixes that we did, again, now we did 2 peat perlite controls, an 80-20 and 70-30. And then we wanted to compare those against a 70-30 peat hydrofiber and a 50 peat, 50 hydrofiber mix. With regards to root dry weight, again, we had no statistical differences among the treatments. However, the 80-20, we maximized root dry weight in this particular instance. However, there were no statistical differences at all between the 4 different media treatments. With regards to shoot dry weight, we did have some statistical differences. We actually saw that the overall maximum shoot dry weight was with the 70-30 peat hydrofiber mix. But you'll notice that when we look at the lowercase letter A, it also shares a lowercase letter A with the both perlite mixes. So these 3 mixes, because they share an A, are statistically the same. You'll notice that with the 50-50 mix, even though it has a single B designation to it, you also notice that both the perlite mixes also have a B designation next to it. So that would mean that even though we had the lowest shoot dry weight with the 50-50 mix in this particular study, it's statistically the same as both peat perlite substrates. So basically when we look at the pictures, what we see is that we were successful creating great quality poinsettia rooted cuttings. And just to tie back in with the study that we did with the Calibrachoa, this particular study, one of the things we did was we took the key learnings with our lime rates from the Calibrachoa study and we applied those to these 2 substrates. So in the case of the 70-30 mix, we used 3 pounds per yard of lime, and with the 50-50 mix, we used 1 pound per yard of lime. And as you can tell from the pHs that we have here, we fell well within the acceptable ranges for substrate pH. So what did we learn? Hydrofiber can be successfully used in propagation. It's safe to use in seedling propagation, but we see a lot of people using it in vegetative propagation. Hydrofiber blends performed equally or better than the controls. However, one thing, as Dr. Bill mentioned, and I just want to reiterate, is that you do need to take care when increasing your rate of hydrofiber in the substrate. If you decide to do so, you definitely need to make sure that you adjust your lime rates accordingly. Now, one thing that I haven't mentioned and haven't really talked about is that this is just some anecdotal observations that Dr. Glenn Fain had made from all the propagation studies that he's done, is that hydrofiber, because of how structured and the matrix that it creates, may have some natural binding activity in it. So this, we've seen that when we pull plugs from the propagation trials that we've done, that the root ball does tend to hold together better. So I know that's important to many growers that are using some of these stabilized substrates. We just wanted to mention that. We don't have any hard data on that, but that's something that we're working on currently. And thank you, everyone, for your time, and just like to field any questions that anyone has now.
All right. Fabulous information. Daniel and Dr. Bill. We've got a few questions. Kevin wants to know, and this goes back to the pH issue. If the pH of peat and hydrofiber are similar, why would the lime requirements differ? I didn't remember if you did note that peat and hydrofiber have the same pH or not, but
No.
go a little bit more about that.
Peat has a low pH. Peat by itself has a low pH, and that's why you have to add limestone to get the pH up. Now, core and hydrofiber probably have more similar pHs. And the other thing about core and hydrofiber and even perlite is they don't require any additional limestone to get the pH up to an acceptable level. So when you start adding more and more and more of those materials, and we're talking about hydrofiber today, so if you add more and more hydrofiber, that's why you have, and less peat, that's why you have to add less lime to compensate for the loss of peat. So you need, if you reduce the amount of peat you use, you're going to be using less limestone to get the pH up to where you want it to be. So it's not that the pHs are the same, it's that once you've added limestone, then the pH comes up to, say, 6, then it's roughly the same pH as what the hydrofiber would be naturally.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, though, real quick, is, we did a great study with Dr. Ryan Dixon of the University of New Hampshire at the time, and this was, I believe, 2017, and, from the study, what we learned, just to put it in perspective, the lime requirements for peat and hydrofiber are vastly different. And, essentially what we found with, a cubic yard of hydrofiber only required about 1/4 pound per yard to raise the pH up to 6, whereas a cubic yard of peat moss at 100% peat required almost 10 pounds per yard. So they have vastly different lime requirements for the two raw materials.
All right. We've got some irrigation questions. First off, watering hydrofiber mixes versus peat mixes.
Yeah, that's a great question. So most of our growers, one of the things that when we start working with growers is irrigation management is something that we spend a lot of time on with them. We talk about surface drying, which is one of the characteristics that many growers talk about when they start working with hydrofiber. Basically, surface drying means that there's a crust that forms, and that crust is usually, a couple millimeters, and that crust basically looks dry in appearance, whereas the lower half of the substrate is still sufficiently wet. And so growers have to take care that they're not just irrigating based on visual appearances, because looks can be deceiving. And so if growers are not taking care to adjust their irrigation accordingly, then they may tend to overwater. And overwatering can not only lead to poor root performance, because oxygenation in the root zone is directly correlated to rooting, but also you can have other things to happen, such as algae, which can also lead to fungus gnats, and those two things can cause problems as well. So water management is very critical. In all these trials that we've done, all these different situations, they were all listed the same. That is something that we have not evaluated officially in some of these trials, but we've discussed as far as how does irrigation frequency change. Based on the physical properties of like a 70-30 mix versus like an 80-20, they both have very similar levels of water holding capacity. So really, if you're working with 30% hydrofiber, you're going to have probably very close to similar misting schedules. But again, I think the most important thing growers need to recognize when they get started working with hydrofiber is that visual cue. And what we recommend is, pulling out the plug or pulling out the root ball from the pot and evaluating the root zone, and then making adjustments to their watering that way.
All right. So basically, you think that both for misting and for irrigation, pretty similar to peat, if you're in the same proportion.
I think it really depends on the physical properties of the mix. So if you're going from an 80-20 to an 80-20 peat hydrofiber mix, it's going to be very much the same. Whereas if you go from an 80-20 peat perlite mix to a 50-50 mix, we're typically going to increase the airspace. The water holding capacity may decrease, and so from there you may want to increase your mist accordingly. But those are all things that on a case-by-case basis we can certainly help make recommendations to the grower.
All right. Is there a wetting agent in hydrofiber?
No, so hydrofiber is 100% natural and organic. So it is OMRI listed. It does not contain a surfactant.
All right. Let's see. Chris wants to know, and not me, because I wouldn't ask anything this genius. What is the percent ratio of cellulose to lignin in hydrofiber?
That's an excellent question, and that's something that we've been asked several times recently, and we actually are in the process of determining that right now. So I don't have an answer at the moment, but can certainly circle back and follow up with that one.
All right. Joshua wants to know if you would assist him when setting up trials.
So we have product reps that are all over the United States, and one of the things that we do is we like to come in, learn about what you're doing in your finished or young plant propagation, what you're currently doing. We make recommendations, and then we help facilitate trials and help get those trials put in place. So absolutely, we would love to help customers get trials in place.
All right, excellent. And Marion wants to know a price comparison between medium grade perlite and hydrofiber for the same volume.
So that's a great question. And you know, perlite prices are highly variable across the United States. And we would like to, you know, basically love to follow up, you know, after this call, and we can discuss pricing specifics then.
All right, Marion, I will provide Daniel's email. You answered one of my questions, which was about, is it OMRI listed? It is, so you can incorporate it into your organic, and in fact, your organic sprouts, no less. My last question would be, since we're talking propagation, do you have any customers who are using ISO planters or auto sticks with hydrofiber Ellepots? And is there any issue with how they would stick into hydrofiber?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we do that are using those machines, and you know, basically what we've found is, it goes back to what I said earlier, is that you know, it's the dibble of the substrate, whether it's in a tray or an Ellepot, is very important, and making sure that you have the right dibble size for when the cutting gets inserted into the substrate. You know, some cuttings that have thicker stems, it's less of an issue, but when you have some cuttings that have thinner stems, the dibble becomes extremely important. And then you know, with the some of the automated machines, the ones that have the clips, basically having a pre-dibbled hole, we feel, is important, because with the hydrofiber very highly structured, you know, once it's there, it doesn't like to move, and so it's not always going to wash back in. So making sure you have the right dibble hole pre-drilled, if you will, to match that clip that's going in, is going to make a huge difference. And you want to make sure after it's stuck, you have good contact with the media and the cutting afterwards. So that may take a little bit of trial and error.
Well, and I think what most people have done with the clips is they water heavier than they used to, just to wash the soil back in around the stem. Because before, when they first started using it, what would happen is, especially on the smaller stem material, the root media, the substrate, wouldn't wash back around the stem, and they'd get ununiform rooting. So they actually, a lot of them have already taken, you know, just watering heavier. That washes enough material back around the stem, and they're back to where they were before with propagation. So I think it's just that initial watering, you have to be a little bit heavier, and that kind of takes care of itself.
Make sure you get good contact, sure. And we'll let Jennifer have the last question. Daniel, where do you source your wood, and are you going to run out of trees?
Great question.
Actually, she was curious, are the trees grown for this purpose? Do you have your own farms?
No. So 90% of our wood chips are sourced within a 75-mile radius of our plant in Conover, North Carolina, which is just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. We're working with 100% loblolly pine, is a specific species that we use in hydrofiber. It is one of the dominantly reforested species in the southeast United States, And the chips that we get are basically a byproduct of the lumber process. So when the lumber mills bring in logs from the tree farms, they get debarked and then they get cut, squared up into planks, if you will, and then those scores that get taken off, the rounded edges gets chipped up, and that's what we purchase. It's a pulp spec chip that we use.
Excellent. So it's sustainable. Nice. Actually, I lied. We're going to let one more question come in because I think it's a good one. Any difference in algae growth on the hydrofiber media compared to regular 80-20 mix?
Great question. So anecdotally, working with growers, we have some growers who have said that algae is better. We have some that say they've had more challenges with algae since using wood fiber and hydrofiber. We've also heard probably the bulk of them say that there's really no difference. We did do a study with Auburn, I believe it was last year, where we compared an 80-20 peat perlite versus 30 and 50% hydrofiber. In that particular study, we did not see any statistical differences between algae growth, but we still have more trials that we're going to do. So early indication is that there's no difference, but we still want to evaluate it closer.
All right, very good. Well, and we actually got to all the questions this time. I'm proud of that. So if you come up with questions, jot down their email addresses. They will be happy to help you out. You see them right there. And if you want to go back and relive this webinar, share it with colleagues, pull out some of those details, you can do that. I'll get it up as quick as I can. GrowerTalks.com/webinars. So that said, I want to thank Bill and Daniel, all the fine folks at Blackmore and Ellepot and Profile Products. Thank you, Profile, for sponsoring this webinar. They put the free in free webinar, as a matter of fact. And on behalf of my staff at Ball Publishing, who work hard so that I don't have to, I'm Chris Beatty saying, so long, everybody.